Afghanistan. 40 years of endless war. The land that refused to heal. This place on earth is so beautiful, yet so broken, that for over 40 years, peace has been nothing more than a rumor. Children there don't dream of becoming astronauts. They dream of surviving the night. This is not just a story about war. This is a story about a country that never got the chance to breathe. A story of foreign powers, forgotten promises, and generations raised in the shadow of gunfire. This is Afghanistan. And this is how 4 decades of endless war reshaped an entire nation. Afghanistan before the fire. Afghanistan was not always what the world sees today. In the 1960s and early 70s, Kabul was a city alive with contrast, in a place where tradition and modernity walked side by side. Women walked freely without fear. Universities were thriving. Tourists passed through on what was once called the hippie trail. But beneath that calm, cracks were forming. A monarchy ruled the country. At its head was Mohammed Zahir Shah. He wasn't widely feared. He wasn't deeply hated. But he also wasn't strong enough to hold together a country that was beginning to change faster than its institutions could handle. In cities, people wanted reform, more freedom, more opportunity. But in rural areas, where most Afghans lived, life remained unchanged. Poverty was widespread, infrastructure was weak, and the reach of the central government was limited. Afghanistan wasn't one unified country. It was a collection of realities moving at different speeds. Then came a man who believed the country had waited long enough. Mohammad Daoud Khan, a former prime minister, a member of the royal family, and a man with a vision far more aggressive than the king's. Daoud didn't believe in slow reform. He believed in control, in strength, in forcing Afghanistan into the future. Then came 1973. In July 1973, everything changed. The king, Zahir Shah, was not even in the country. He was in Italy, seeking medical treatment. And in his absence, Daoud made his move. But this was not a chaotic uprising. It was calculated, precise, almost silent. Daoud had spent months building alliances within the military, particularly among officers who were frustrated with the monarchy's weakness. And he also had quiet support from factions within the People's Democratic Party of Afghanistan, a leftist group that saw opportunity in regime change. In the early hours of the morning, military units loyal to Daoud moved into position. Tanks rolled into Kabul. But there was no panic, no mass resistance. Key locations were taken swiftly: the royal palace, government ministries, communication centers. Radio Afghanistan was seized, and then an announcement. The monarchy was over. Afghanistan was now a republic. This coup was bloodless and unusual because there was no large-scale fighting, no prolonged battle in the streets. The army, the very force meant to protect the king, did not resist. Why? Because many within it had already chosen a side. The monarchy had lost its grip long before that night. So when the moment came, it collapsed almost effortlessly. King Zahir Shah from abroad made a decision that would define the moment. He chose not to return and fight. Instead, he abdicated, ending over 200 years of monarchical rule. Just like that, an entire era disappeared. At first, nothing seemed to break. The streets didn't erupt. Daily life continued, and for many, the change even felt hopeful. A republic sounded modern, strong, forward-looking. Daoud became Afghanistan's first president. He promised economic development, national unity, independence from foreign control. But beneath that calm, the real damage had already begun. Because the coup didn't solve Afghanistan's problems, it exposed them. Yet for the first time, power in Afghanistan no longer came from tradition or royal legitimacy. It came from force, from the military, from political alliances, from whoever could take and hold control. And that changed everything. Because once power is taken by force, it can be taken again. Political groups began positioning themselves. Ideologies began to clash more openly. Communists pushing radical reform, Islamists resisting change, nationalists demanding strength and unity, and Daoud, caught in the middle, began to lose control of the very forces that helped him rise. What followed was not immediate chaos, but something far more dangerous. A quiet instability. Tension without explosion. Division without resolution. The kind of silence that comes right before a storm. Because Afghanistan had crossed a line. It had moved from slow, fragile stability into a new era where power would no longer be inherited, but fought for. And in just 5 years, that fragile republic would be shattered again. This time, not with silence, but with violence. Because the coup of 1973 did not start a war, but it made war inevitable. The Soviet invasion, 1979. Everything changed. The Soviet Union marched into Afghanistan. Officially, they claimed they were helping stabilize the country. In reality, they were stepping into a trap. What they expected to be a quick intervention became a brutal, grinding. Villages were bombed. Families were torn apart. Millions fled their homes. But Afghanistan did not fall quietly. Resistance fighters known as the Mujahideen rose from the mountains, poorly equipped but fiercely determined, and they were not alone. The United States, Pakistan, Saudi Arabia all poured money, weapons, and training into the resistance. This was no longer just a war. It had become a battlefield of the Cold War, a proxy conflict, a game of power played on Afghan soil with Afghan lives. For nearly 10 years, the war dragged on, until finally, 1989, the Soviets left. But they did not leave behind peace. They left behind something worse, a power vacuum. Civil War, when neighbors became enemies. With the Soviets gone, Afghanistan should have had a chance to rebuild. Instead, it collapsed into chaos. The very fighters who once stood side by side turned on each other. Warlords carved the country into pieces. Kabul, once vibrant, became a war zone. Rockets rained down on neighborhoods. Civilians became targets. Trust disappeared. This was not a war between nations anymore. This was brother against brother. And in the middle of this destruction, a new force began to rise. One that promised order, one that promised peace, but would deliver something far darker. The rise of the Taliban, mid-1990s. From refugee camps and religious schools came a group known as the Taliban. Many were young, many had known nothing but war. And they offered something people were desperate for: stability. They moved quickly. City after city fell under their control. By 1996, they had taken Kabul. At first, some welcomed them, because after years of chaos, any form of order felt like hope. But that hope didn't last. The Taliban enforced a strict interpretation of Islamic law. Women were erased from public life. Education for girls was banned. Punishments became brutal and public. Afghanistan had not found peace. It had entered a different kind of prison. The war returns. September 11th, 2001. The world watched in shock as the United States was attacked. And suddenly, Afghanistan was back in global focus. The Taliban had given the shelter to Al-Qaeda, and the response was swift. The United States, along with its allies, invaded Afghanistan. Within weeks, the Taliban government fell. It seemed like a turning point, a chance to rebuild, a chance to finally end the cycle. But war has a way of returning. The Taliban did not disappear. They went underground, and slowly, they came back. The longest war. What followed was the longest war in modern American history. For 20 years, Afghanistan became a battleground once again. Billions of dollars were spent. Governments were built and rebuilt. Promises were made, but on the ground, reality was different. Corruption spread, trust faded, and violence never truly stopped. Entire generations grew up knowing nothing but conflict. A child born in 2001 would become an adult without ever experiencing peace. And then, in 2021, everything changed again. The withdrawal in history repeats. After 2 decades, the United States withdrew, and almost overnight, the Taliban returned to power. Cities fell rapidly. The government collapsed, and the world watched, stunned, as history seemed to repeat itself. People clung to airplanes, desperate to escape. Fear returned, uncertainty returned, and for many Afghans, it felt like nothing had changed at all. 40 years, 4 decades of war, millions displaced, hundreds of thousands dead, and a question that still has no answer. Will Afghanistan ever know peace? Because this is not just a story about conflict. It's a story about endurance, about people who wake up every day in a country that has never stopped fighting, a place where history doesn't feel like the past. It feels like something that never ended. Afghanistan is not just a war story. It is a warning of what happens when power outweighs people, when nations fight battles on someone else's land, and when the world moves on, but the suffering stays behind. And somewhere in Afghanistan tonight, another child will fall asleep to the sound of a war that began long before they were born and may not end in their lifetime.